Imagine, it is early 1946.
Right.
The British Empire has, against all odds, miraculously survived the absolute onslaught of World War II.
Barely survived, but yes.
Barely, yeah. But across the Indian subcontinent, the geopolitical ground is just completely giving way.
It's crumbling.
Exactly. And in Bombay, the unthinkable happens. The Royal Indian Navy mutinies.
Which is huge.
It's massive. You have armed Indian sailors literally taking over ships. They're lowering the Union Jack, and they are pointing the ship's guns squarely at the British colonial establishment.
It is the ultimate imperial nightmare come to life.
Right. An armed, highly organized, furious military uprising.
Yeah.
Now, if you were listening to this and you're looking at it through the traditional lens of history, you would naturally assume that the leaders of the Indian independence movement, the famous figures fighting for freedom, would be celebrating in the streets.
You'd think they'd be thrilled.
Right. You would think they would rush down to the docks to declare final victory.
Because that's the goal, right? Ousting the British.
Exactly. But they didn't. In fact, the absolute biggest names in Indian nationalism, the elite vanguard fighting for freedom, actually joined hands with the British colonial commanders to suppress the mutiny.
It's wild. They actually told the sailors to surrender.
Yeah, they told the public to go home. And today, we are going to figure out exactly why that happened.
It is a moment that completely breaks the conventional narrative of how nations are born.
It really does.
And it perfectly encapsulates the profound, often really uncomfortable complexities we are going to unpack today.
So we are taking a deep dive into an absolute watershed text in the study of modern history.
Yes. Sumit Sarkar's 1983 masterpiece, Modern India, 1885-1947.
And the reason we are spending so much time on this specific book is because of what Sarkar actually attempted to do with it.
Right, his methodology.
Exactly. He looked at the way history was being written, which was usually, from a penthouse suite.
Always from the top down.
Yeah, focused entirely on the elites, the generals, the politicians signing treaties in these nice wood-paneled rooms.
Right.
And he decided to drag the camera down into the mud. He set out to write a history of this massive national transition from the perspective of the peasants, the laborers, the tribal communities.
What we call a history from below.
Exactly. But the real magic trick here, and I think the central tension of his work, is that he still had to explain the elite political endgame.
Because that endgame actually resulted in the creation of the modern Indian and Pakistani states.
Right. You can't just ignore the elites entirely because they did sign the papers.
Totally. And to truly appreciate the intellectual earthquake this book caused when it was published, we have to understand the historiographical landscape that existed before Sumit Sarkar put pen to paper.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, if you were a university student studying Indian history in, say, the 1960s or 70s, you were essentially forced to choose between two completely opposing and, frankly, heavily flawed camps.
Let me guess, neither of them were great.
No, they weren't. On one side, you had the nationalist historiography,
which I imagine was the dominant sort of state-sanctioned version of events after independence.
Oh, extremely dominant. This was a highly celebratory post-independence framework.
It's the story the new nation wanted to tell about itself.
Exactly. It was designed to build a national identity, so it intentionally glossed over internal social tensions.
Like sweeping the messy stuff under the rug.
Precisely. It minimized class conflict, it smoothed over horrific caste issues, and it totally ignored agrarian friction in order to paint this glorious unified picture.
Right.
It was basically a narrative of great, flawless leaders guiding a monolithic, united people to freedom against the evil British Empire.
It's the classic hero's journey. I mean, it feels good to read, but it completely erases the messy reality of millions of people who were, often fighting each other just as much as they were fighting the British.
Exactly. Now, on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, you had what was known as the Cambridge School.
Okay.
And this was a deeply cynical approach to history. Mm-hmm. It relied heavily on a concept known as namerism.
Okay, let's unpack namerism, because that's one of those terms that gets thrown around in academic circles, but rarely gets actually explained to anyone else.
Sure.
What is the actual mechanism of a namerist history?
Well, namerism is named after the historian Louis Namer, and it is a framework that essentially strips all ideology, all passion, and all principle out of politics.
So it's just pure mechanics.
Basically. It treats the political sphere purely as an aggregate of individual self-interest, factionalism, and patronage networks.
Wow. Okay.
So when the Cambridge School historians looked at the Indian independence movement, they didn't see a grand struggle for liberty or human rights at all.
What did they see?
They argued that Indian nationalism was basically a fiction.
A fiction.
Yeah. To them, it was just local Indian elites fighting with each other over who got access to British patronage, civil service jobs, and local power.
I see. So it's like viewing the entirety of a massive revolution as just a petty, internal corporate restructuring.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like watching a reality TV show and only focusing on the backstabbing and the alliances in the confessional booth.
Right. Exactly.
And by obsessing over those elite patron-client rat races, the Cambridge School completely missed the fact that outside the halls of power, there were genuine ideological passions.
Yes.
And massive earth-shaking grassroots movements happening among millions of ordinary people.
That is precisely the trap. And Sarkar surveyed both of these schools, the celebratory myth-making nationalists and the deeply cynical Cambridge historians, and he realized they shared one fatal flaw.
Which is?
They both completely ignored the actual masses.
They left out the people.
He recognized that you cannot explain the birth of modern India without centering the subalterns.
The marginalized, the oppressed, the workers, and the peasants.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we jump into the actual timeline of 1885 to 1947, I want to establish the ground rules of Sarkar's methodology here.
Good idea.
Because saying you were going to write a history from below sounds really noble, but how do you actually execute that?
It's tough.
We have this methodological essay Sarkar wrote a bit later in 1985 about social history, which really lays out his analytical lens.
Yes.
And he starts by absolutely tearing into the traditional approach to social history in India, which he calls residual.
The residual approach, yeah. He argued that academia had treated social history as just the leftovers.
Like the scraps.
Exactly. If history was a pie, the big, important slices were politics, wars, and economics.
Right.
And whatever crumbs were left on the plate, stuff that didn't fit into the grand narrative, was tossed into a bucket called social history.
So what did that look like in practice?
In practical terms, this meant social history was often just equated with middle-class social reform.
Okay.
It was the history of educated elites debating whether to change marriage laws or reform educational curricula, rather than the brutal, lived experience of the masses.
Which is basically just another form of elite history disguised as social history.
Exactly.
But Sarkar also warns against swinging the pendulum too wildly in the other direction.
He does.
He highlights two massive dangers when historians finally decide to look at the peasantry.
He is incredibly rigorous about this. The first danger he identifies is economic reductionism.
Okay, break that down for us.
This is the intellectual trap of treating subaltern rebellion as a mindless, automatic, almost biological response to physical suffering.
Like a reflex.
Right. A historian falling into this trap might write something like, the price of grain went up by 20% in 1890, and therefore the peasants rioted.
It turns human beings into simple input-output machines.
Exactly.
It robs the insurgents of their agency, right? Their complex ideologies and their rational decision-making processes.
Yes. It implies they only rebel when their stomachs are empty, rather than because they have a sophisticated understanding of their own exploitation.
Okay, so that's the first danger. What's the second?
The second danger, which is honestly the trap most well-meaning progressive historians fall into, is romanticization. This is the assumption that the masses are innately militant, constantly ready to rebel, and that absolutely every initiative taken by the lower classes is automatically progressive and good.
Which is just statistically unlikely.
Exactly. Sarkar warns that if you romanticize the subaltern, you end up anachronistically projecting your own modern 21st century political desires onto historical figures.
Who probably operated with very different and sometimes deeply conservative motivations.
Exactly.
So if he rejects the biological machine theory and he rejects the romantic hero theory, what are the actual theoretical tools he brings to the table to understand the masses?
Well, Sarkar advocates for a materialist concept of culture. He heavily utilizes Gramscian concepts, specifically hegemony.
Hegemony.
Yeah.
Let's define that for the listener.
Sure. Hegemony is the mechanism by which a ruling class dominates society not just by physical force, not just by having the biggest army, but by shaping the cultural, moral, and ideological norms of the society so effectively that their rule seems entirely natural and inevitable to the very people being oppressed.
That's a terrifyingly effective way to rule.
It is, and he combines this with the historian Carlo Ginzburg's conjectural paradigm.
The conjectural paradigm.
Yeah.
How does that actually work in practice when you are staring at a dusty archive?
It is essentially historical detective work.
Okay.
Because the subalterns rarely leave behind written memoirs or massive archives, you have to ferret out clues from their lived experiences.
You have to read between the lines.
Exactly. You have to read elite documents against a grain, looking for the silences, the anxieties of the rulers, and the subtle traces of lower-class resistance.
Right.
Crucially, Sarkar strictly warns against using a framework called structural functionalism, which was highly popular in anthropology at the time.
Let's break down structural functionalism really quickly.
Yeah.
If society is a machine, how does a structural functionalist look at it?
A structural functionalist looks at the machine of society and only asks how all the parts work together to maintain cohesion, equilibrium, and stability.
So they assume society naturally wants to be at peace.
Right. Sarkar argues that if you put on structural functionalist glasses, you immediately become blind to class conflict.
Interesting.
You become so obsessed with marveling at how the gears turn together smoothly that you completely ignore the rust, the friction, and the fact that the larger gears are systematically grinding the smaller gears into dust.
Wow. To really cement this methodology for the listener, I think we need to look at a concrete example of how Sarkar applies this detective work.
Yes, let's do that.
Because the analysis he does of the Ramakrishna Kathamrita is completely mind-blowing.
It really is one of his finest applications of this theory.
So what's the text?
The Ramakrishna Kathamrita is a late 19th century text recording the conversations of the Bengali mystic Ramakrishna and his disciples.
Okay.
Now, a traditional historian would read this simply to understand religious doctrine or spiritual history.
Sure, take it at face value.
But Sarkar reads it for deep social clues.
Yeah.
He uses it to unearth the incredibly complex, profoundly ambiguous psychological relationship between the lower middle classes and the Babu.
The Babu being the wealthy, educated elite patron.
Right.
He explores this dynamic where the wealthy patron is simultaneously deeply resented for his wealth and power, yet culturally worshipped by the lower classes.
It's a massive contradiction.
And the mechanism that mediates this contradiction is bhakti, or devotion.
Yes. Sarkar shows how the cultural concept of bhakti provided the downtrodden with a crucial psychological living space.
Like a coping mechanism.
Exactly. It gave them a sense of spiritual dignity in a world that offered them zero material dignity.
But here is the tragic dialectic Sarkar uncovers. Bhakti also functioned as an ideological trap.
That's a kicker.
By viewing the Babu through a lens of spiritual devotion, the lower classes softened the psychological edges of their own exploitation. It made oppressive, feudal-style hierarchies easier to endure, and therefore it accidentally helped those hierarchies survive much longer.
It is a coping mechanism that inadvertently reinforces the bars of the cage.
Wow.
And Sarkar contrasts this traditional patronage with the rising colonial concept of chakri, which means clerical or office work.
And this blew my mind when I read it.
It's fascinating.
He points out that to the traditional Indian mindset at the time, chakri felt like a form of bondage to satya.
Because it was fundamentally alienating. Under the old system, a patron exploited you, yes, but there was a paternalistic human relationship there.
Right. There were mutual, albeit deeply unequal, obligations.
Exactly. Chakri, on the other hand, was wage labor under a cold, impersonal cash nexus dictated by the British colonial state or a massive capitalist enterprise.
You're just a disposable cog.
Yes. And this deep dive into how economic shifts alter human psychology is the essence of Sarkar's history from below.
Okay, so we have the lens. We know we are looking for the hidden mechanics of hegemony. We are avoiding romanticization, and we are tracking the material realities hidden inside cultural shifts.
We're ready.
Let's step into the timeline of the book itself. Chapters 1 and 2 lay the foundation, and Sarkar hits us with a thesis right out of the gate that is incredibly jarring.
It really sets the tone.
He states that the period from 1885 to 1947 was India's greatest historical transition, but he deliberately characterizes it as grievously incomplete.
That phrase, grievously incomplete, is the ghost that haunts every subsequent chapter of the book.
Oh, so what does he mean by that?
His core argument is that political freedom from the British Empire was indeed achieved in 1947.
Right.
But the fundamental social transformation of India, the eradication of crippling poverty, the dismantling of feudal land structures, the destruction of the caste hierarchy was aborted.
The revolution stopped halfway.
Exactly.
And to understand why it stalled, we have to look at the behemoth they were fighting. The autocratic British Raj.
The colonial state.
And Sarkar spends chapter 2 meticulously dismantling the greatest myth of the British Empire.
Oh, he goes right after it.
This is the liberal, paternalistic myth that British rule was essentially a long, benevolent tutoring session, gradually preparing the Indian people for democratic self-government.
Sarkar has absolutely no patience for that narrative.
None.
He proves it false by looking at the actual mechanics of colonial governance. For instance, liberal historians often point to the 1861 Councils Act as an early step toward representative government.
Right.
Sarkar completely inversed this. He explains how the 1861 Act actually functioned to hyper-centralize authority in the hands of the viceroy.
Right, through the introduction of the portfolio system, which, if we think about it, operates a lot like a modern corporate restructuring designed to kill internal debate.
That is a perfect analogy.
Walk us through how that worked.
So before the portfolio system, the viceroy had a council, and they debated issues collectively. It was slow, but it required consensus. The portfolio system carved the government up into rigid departments, finance, home, military, and put one loyal executive in charge of each.
So it looks like delegation.
It looks like it, but it actually meant the viceroy could bypass collective deliberation entirely and rule by executive fiat through his hand-picked department heads.
It stripped away the checks and balances.
Exactly. And as for the later 1892 reforms, which expanded the council slightly, Sarkar dismisses them as merely decorative.
Decorative.
Window dressing for an autocracy.
Decorative is such a lethal word for constitutional amendment.
It really is.
And then Sarkar moves from the political structure to the raw structural racism of the administration.
Yes.
He uses a specific data point here that is just staggering to comprehend. He notes that in the early 1880s, if you looked at the Indian civil service, the incredibly powerful bureaucracy that actually collected the taxes, ran the courts, and ruled the districts, there were 900 top-tier posts.
900 posts.
Out of those 900 people ruling a subcontinent of hundreds of millions, exactly 16 were Indian. 16 out of 900.
And it wasn't because Indians lacked the intellect.
Of course not.
It was because the British designed the entrance exams as an exclusionary fortress. The exams were held only in London.
Oh, wow. Only in London.
Right. And they tested obscure European classical languages, and they constantly lowered the maximum age limit to ensure Indians, who had to cross an ocean just to sit for the test, could rarely qualify.
It was an administration engineered for foreign extraction, not local preparation.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the economic engine of that extraction, which Sarkar argues caused profound, lasting damage.
The economic drain.
He dives into the drain of wealth theory and actively debates revisionist historians like Morris D. Morris, who tried to argue in the mid-20th century that British rule didn't actually cause the deindustrialization of India.
Right. Morris D. Morris and others argued that Indian artisans simply couldn't compete with the natural efficiency of the British Industrial Revolution.
Like it was just market forces.
Exactly. But Sarkar absolutely demolishes this argument.
How so?
He brings the localized data to prove that indigenous artisan production wasn't just outcompeted, it was actively politically gutted.
Through legislation.
By discriminatory tariffs and colonial policies designed to force India into being a pure exporter of raw materials and a captive market for finished British goods.
And when the artisans lose their livelihoods, they are forced back onto the land, right? Which leads us to the agricultural sector.
And the situation there was catastrophic.
Sarkar utilizes a concept formulated by Daniel Thorner called the built-in depressor.
I love this concept.
I do too, because it explains the economic paradox of Indian agriculture perfectly. It acts as a massive economic speed bump.
Explain how you see that speed bump operating on the ground for the listener.
Okay, so imagine you are a peasant farmer renting land. The colonial system forces you to grow cash crops like indigo or cotton because you need cash to pay the newly instituted British land taxes.
Right, you were forced into the commercial market.
Exactly. So you are commercialized. But this built-in depressor is the parasitic hierarchy above you. It's like renting an apartment where your landlord legally monitors your income.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
If you invent a better plow, you work twice as hard, and you double your crop yield, the zamindar, the landlord, simply hikes your rent by the exact amount of your extra profit.
He absorbs all your surplus.
Every bit of it. So as a peasant, why would you ever invest in better technology? You have zero incentive to innovate.
Precisely. And flip it to the zamindar's perspective. Does the landlord have any incentive to invest his vast wealth into tractors, irrigation, or modern agricultural science?
Nope.
No, because he can make an absolute fortune simply by squeezing the existing peasants harder or by acting as a moneylender and trapping them in debt at extortionate interest rates.
The system guaranteed that the people with the money wouldn't invest in production, and the people doing the production couldn't accumulate the money to invest.
It was a vicious cycle that kept Indian agriculture technologically stunted for a century while maximizing human misery.
Okay, so the peasants are trapped, agriculture is stagnant. What about the Indian business class? We always hear about these massive Indian industrial families emerging. Surely they were thriving.
They were growing, but in a highly stunted, deformed manner.
Tell me again.
Sarkar details how the British maintained a suffocating collective monopoly over the crucial arteries of the global economy: banking, shipping, insurance, and overseas trade networks.
So they controlled the infrastructure.
Exactly. This effectively boxed in the Indian bourgeoisie. They could build a textile mill, but they had to use British banks to finance it, British ships to transport the goods, and British insurance to protect it.
They were structurally dependent.
They were not the muscular, independent, revolutionary bourgeoisie that you saw overthrowing the feudal order in France or America.
Okay, let me pause here and play devil's advocate for the listener for a second. If you and I are reading a book about a political freedom movement, a story about Gandhi, Nehru, and the fight for independence, why is Sarkar spending chapters obsessing over the structural weaknesses of the Indian capitalist class?
It seems disconnected.
Right. Why does the bank account or the shipping dependency of a Bombay industrialist matter when we were talking about a national revolution?
Because it is the skeleton key to understanding the entire 60-year timeline we're about to discuss.
Oh, really?
Yes. A weak, dependent capitalist class matters immensely because their weakness generates political terror.
Terror of what?
In a classic capitalist revolution, the bourgeoisie boldly allies with the peasant masses to completely smash the old regime. But the Indian bourgeoisie was too economically weak and dependent to stand on its own.
Right.
More importantly, they were terrified of the masses. They knew that if they encouraged a massive, uncontrollable social upheaval among the peasants and workers to physically oust the British, that same revolutionary inferno would not stop at the viceroy's palace. It would immediately spread to their factories and their vast land holdings.
Okay, I see. So their ultimate goal was to politely ask the British to leave the executive boardroom, but they absolutely, under no circumstances, wanted the workers to burn down the factory to make it happen.
Exactly. This profound fear of a genuine social revolution forces the Indian elite to constantly act as a brake on the national movement.
They're the ones pumping the brakes.
Whenever the mass movement gets truly radical, the elites step in to shut it down.
That dynamic is going to play out tragically over and over again. Which brings us to part 3 of the narrative. Chapter 3, the roots of resistance.
Right.
If the Indian elite is economically stunted, cautious, and terrified of revolution, where does the actual fire of resistance originate? Who is supplying the kinetic energy for this movement?
The kinetic energy, the raw courage, came entirely from the subalterns.
The mass.
From the tribal communities, the deeply oppressed peasantry, the very people traditional historiography dismissed as background characters. Sarkar spends chapter 3 proving that the subalterns were fighting the empire long before the elites even formed a political party.
When Sarkar looks at tribal agency, his breakdown of Birsa Munda's Ogilan the Great Tumult of the late 1890s is completely fascinating.
It's brilliant.
Colonial records and old-school historians usually dismissed tribal uprisings as primitive rebellions, just irrational, spontaneous outbursts of violence by people with bows and arrows who didn't understand the modern world. But Sarkar reveals it to be a highly rational, almost scientific escalation of political tactics.
Yes, Sarkar traces the intellectual evolution of the Munda rebellion through their own famous slogans and petitions.
Walk us through that.
He shows that the Mundas didn't just wake up one day and decide to attack the state. They followed a rigorous process. First, they appealed directly to the British Sarkar through legal channels and petitions,
hoping the colonial state would protect them from the daikas, the outside landlords and moneylenders stealing their ancestral lands.
Right, but the state did nothing.
So step 1, institutional reform, fails. What's step 2?
Step 2, they turned to the Christian missionaries. They hoped that aligning with the religion of the rulers would provide them a shield against exploitation.
That makes strategic sense.
It does, but they quickly realized the missionaries were completely intertwined with the colonial power structure and wouldn't actually protect their material land rights.
So the NGO soft power route fails, which leads them to the final, chillingly logical conclusion. There is nothing left for us but to look to one of our own men.
Exactly. Bursa Munda emerges not out of primitive superstition, but because armed autonomy was the only mathematically viable option left to survive.
It is a devastating critique of the idea that subalterns lack political sophistication.
It really is.
And Sarkar also applies this rigorous lens to the massive Mopla outbreaks in the Malabar region.
Now, the Mopla outbreaks are notoriously complex.
Because they took the form of intense religious violence.
Yeah.
Right. Sarkar even uses the term rural terrorism. How does he analyze this without falling into either the trap of dismissing them as mere religious fanatics or romanticizing their violence?
He borrows a framework from the historian Eric Hobsbawm regarding millenarian movements. The Moplas were impoverished Muslim peasants severely exploited by upper caste Hindu landlords who were backed by the British courts.
Okay.
Sarkar argues that because the Moplas completely lacked a modern secular revolutionary ideology, they didn't have access to Marxist texts or Enlightenment philosophy.
Right.
Their deeply material grievances found expression through the only ideological language they possessed. Religious millenarianism.
So the vocabulary of the rebellion was religious, but the grammar and the actual targets were entirely economic.
That's a great way to summarize it.
They were attacking the specific landlords and moneylenders who were starving them, but they framed it as a holy war because that was the only conceptual framework available to unite them.
Precisely. And this intersection of identity and material reality brings Sarkar to the issue of caste.
Let's talk about caste.
The British colonial state, obsessed with categorizing its subjects, instituted these massive decennial censuses, and Sarkar points out a fascinating paradox here.
What's the paradox?
The British thought they were just neutrally measuring the caste system, but by rigidly ranking every caste on official government documents, they inadvertently poured gasoline on caste consciousness.
Because suddenly where you fell on that official list determined your access to colonial resources, jobs, and social standing.
Exactly. The census stimulated a massive wave of what sociologists call Sanskritizing movements.
Let's explain Sanskritization. This is essentially when a lower caste attempts upward social mobility by artificially adopting the rituals, dietary habits, and social customs of the higher caste, right?
Yes. They mimic the oppressors to petition the British for a higher official rank in the next census. And Sarkar is very critical of this. He notes that Sanskritizing movements did not challenge the caste hierarchy, they merely validated it.
They just wanted a better seat on the Titanic.
Right. They just wanted to climb one rung higher on the ladder while stepping on the people below them. However, Sarkar is careful to distinguish these conservative movements from genuinely radical anti-caste uprisings.
Like the Satyashodhak Samaj, founded by Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra.
Exactly. The Satyashodhak Samaj was not trying to Sanskritize. They were trying to dynamite the entire ladder.
They sought to completely dismantle Brahminical hegemony and the structural inequality of the caste system itself.
Yes.
Okay, so we have this massive boiling cauldron of subaltern energy tribal uprisings, peasant millenarianism, radical anti-caste movements. Meanwhile, what is the elite intelligentsia doing?
Right. What are the elites up to?
Sarkar introduces the early moderate phase of the Indian National Congress. And he gives them their due intellectually, doesn't he?
He does. He acknowledges that intellectuals like Dadabhai Naoroji and M.G. Ranade were brilliant economists.
They formulated the drain of wealth theory, meticulously proving with data how British colonialism was systematically impoverishing India.
Intellectually, they laid the foundation for nationalism. But politically, Sarkar eviscerates them.
He calls their political methodology mendicant, which literally means begging.
It was polite constitutional begging. They wrote very eloquent letters to the editor in London.
Very polite.
They passed polite resolutions asking the viceroy to please be a bit nicer and perhaps hire a few more Indians into the civil service.
But they had no connection to the ground.
Absolutely zero connection to the tribal fighters, the Mokla peasants, or the factory workers. Their utter elitism and their totally ineffective mendicant approach eventually created such immense frustration among the younger generation that it birthed the extremist faction within the nationalist movement.
So we have these two completely alienated tracks. Track A is the elite political critique. It has the theory, the education, and the legal arguments, but absolutely no muscle. Track B is the massive subaltern grievance. It has all the kinetic energy of the bodies and the raw fire, but lacks a unifying national organizational structure.
So when do they meet?
Right. When do these two tracks finally collide? That brings us to Chapter 4, and the catalyst is the Viceroy, Lord Curzon.
Lord Curzon was a notoriously arrogant administrator, utterly obsessed with what Sarkar calls a cult of efficiency.
Okay.
In 1905, Curzon looked at the province of Bengal, which was massive and heavily populated, and decided it was simply too unwieldy to administer efficiently. So he unilaterally partitioned it into 2 separate provinces.
But the people of Bengal did not experience this as an innocent administrative tweak.
Not at all.
They recognized it immediately as a deliberate, calculated strategy to physically divide the Bengali-speaking intelligentsia and pit Hindu and Muslim populations against each other. It was felt as a profound national insult.
And the resultant explosion of anger triggered the Swadeshi movement.
Now, the Swadeshi movement is arguably the first real mass upsurge of Indian nationalism.
Swadeshi meaning of one's own country.
Right. It involved massive boycotts of British manufactured goods, public burnings of Manchester cloth, the promotion of indigenous industries, and massive street protests.
For a brief moment, it seemed like the elite intelligentsia and the masses were finally marching together.
But Sarkar, acting as the clinical diagnostician, is deeply interested in the anatomy of its failure because the movement eventually collapsed.
And the lazy historical answer is always, the British Empire crushed it with overwhelming force.
Right. But Sarkar brings out the data to prove that wasn't the case.
The data is shocking.
He cites an astonishing statistic. By 1909, after years of massive upheaval, the total number of prosecutions directed against the open movement in Bengal was only 105.
Think about the implication of that number. 105 prosecutions in a province of millions.
It's nothing.
You cannot crush a genuine, unified mass revolution with 105 court cases.
Right. If the British only had to prosecute 105 people, it means they didn't even need to swing the hammer. It means the movement collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
Exactly. Sarkar unpacks those fatal internal flaws. First, the movement failed to secure the backing of the Indian business class, who were still too dependent on the British supply chain to risk a full boycott.
So no money.
Right. Second, and much more devastatingly, was the sociological nature of the Bhadralok, the educated middle-class Bengali leadership steering the movement.
This goes back to the built-in depressor we talked about earlier. These Bhadralok intellectuals, as progressive as they sounded in their speeches, were fundamentally reliant on the rent they extracted from the peasantry.
Yes. They were parasitic landholders. So when they went to the villages to mobilize the peasants for the Swadeshi movement, they hit a brick wall. They could tell the peasant to boycott British cloth, but they were structurally incapable of addressing the peasants' actual primary grievance, the crushing rent demanded by the landlord.
Because they were the landlords.
Exactly. The economic contradiction made true solidarity impossible.
And to try and paper over this massive economic divide, the Bhadralok leadership made a fatal tactical error. They tried to generate emotional unity by relying heavily on Hindu revivalist imagery. They used Hindu oaths in temples to seal political pledges.
And predictably, this deeply alienated the massive Muslim peasantry in East Bengal, who felt completely excluded from the cultural symbolism of the movement.
The British, of course, watched this alienation with absolute glee and aggressively fanned the communal flame.
Well, of course they did.
When the open Swadeshi mass movement sputtered and died due to these contradictions, the immense frustration drove many young, passionate nationalists underground into secret societies.
This ushers in the phase of revolutionary terrorism.
Now, Sarkar doesn't dismiss these young revolutionaries. He acknowledges their incredible bravery and calls their willingness to sacrifice themselves heroic.
But analytically, he is ruthlessly critical of their strategy and their social exclusivity.
He views revolutionary terrorism as a tragic, elite dead end. And again, he uses precise demographic data to prove his point.
The stats are wild.
He looks at an official 1918 government list of 186 killed or convicted revolutionaries in Bengal. Out of those 186 martyrs, a staggering 165 of them came from just 3 elite upper castes, Brahmin, Kayasta, and Vaidya.
So 165 out of 186. That is wild.
It proves this wasn't a vanguard of the proletariat. It was an incredibly exclusive upper caste club.
It was a quixotic cult of martyrdom. Because they had utterly failed to build a mass base among the peasantry, their strategy of assassinating isolated British officials or throwing bombs could never fundamentally shake the foundations of the colonial state.
It was individual heroism substituting for mass action.
And the British capitalized on all of this disunity, this failure of the Congress to bridge the Hindu-Muslim divide with the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909.
This is the classic imperial divide and rule tactic codified into law. The British introduced separate electorates, meaning Muslims would vote in separate constituencies for Muslim-only candidates.
And Sarkar shatters any illusion that the British did this out of a noble desire to protect minority rights.
Oh, he brings the receipts.
He quotes Lord Minto's own private correspondence. Minto literally admitted behind closed doors that Muslims weren't actually entitled to the disproportionate number of seats allotted to them.
Unbelievable.
It wasn't about democratic fairness. It was a deliberate, calculated, cynical tactic to permanently institutionalize the communal divisions that the Congress had failed to heal.
Which brings us to the great turning point in our narrative, covered in chapters 5 and 6. The Swadeshi movement proved definitively that without the masses, elite nationalism is powerless.
So how did the movement finally cross that vast chasm to reach the people?
The answer is a spectacular collision of two forces: the massive economic shockwaves of World War I and the arrival of a man named Mohandas Gandhi.
We have to set the economic stage first, because Sarkar identifies a recurring macroeconomic pattern that dictates the political rhythm of the 1920s and 30s. It's the dual impact of global crises.
Okay, let's look at World War I. The British war machine demanded heavy taxes, massive forced recruitment of soldiers from the villages, and it triggered a rampant, devastating inflation.
This absolutely crushed the Indian peasantry, driving them to the brink of starvation.
But simultaneously, the war severed global shipping lanes. British manufactured imports abruptly stopped,
Which created a massive vacuum, allowing Indian businesses to step in, monopolize the domestic market, and make fabulous, unprecedented profits.
So you have a situation where the peasants are starving and desperate, while the Indian capitalists are getting incredibly rich, powerful, and politically confident.
Exactly. And Sarkar shows this exact same dual dynamic repeating during the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The global crash in agricultural prices devastated the middle peasantry, burying them under mountains of debt and driving them to sheer desperation. But the Depression also severely weakened the British industrial heartland, allowing Indian textile mill production to finally permanently surpass Lancashire imports.
So in both decades, you have a deeply aggrieved, massive rural population ready to explode with nothing to lose, sitting right alongside a growing, increasingly muscular Indian business class, looking for a way to leverage that rural anger to extract political concessions from the British.
And into this incredibly combustible, highly unstable mixture steps Mahatma Gandhi.
Gandhi is the alchemy that finally bonds these two disparate elements together.
Now, everyone knows the traditional narrative of Gandhi, the ashrams, the disciplined cadres, the high moral philosophy of nonviolent satyagraha.
Right, the peaceful saint.
But Sarkar digs into the archives and reveals that the actual terrifyingly powerful engine of Gandhi's early success wasn't his philosophical writing. It was something entirely out of his control. It was rumor.
The role of rumor in a predominantly illiterate, deeply stressed agrarian society is one of Sarkar's most fascinating contributions.
It really is.
Gandhi effectively became an empty vessel into which the masses poured their own most radical hopes.
I was trying to conceptualize how this worked, and it honestly feels exactly like a modern viral internet phenomenon.
Yes. Gandhi essentially created a highly potent personal brand. The asceticism, the homespun cloth, the simplicity, the fearless defiance of authority, he releases that brand into the world.
And then the users, the peasants in the distant villages who have never met him and can't read his articles, take that brand, remix it, distort it, and project their own specific immediate grievances onto it.
That is a brilliant analogy. The rumor of Gandhi was infinitely more powerful and far more revolutionary than the man himself.
Sarkar cites colonial CID intelligence reports from 1921 that are just astonishing.
What do they say?
They show that peasants in Awadh genuinely believed Gandhi was going to abolish the zamindari system. They believed he was going to magically redistribute the land to the tillers and abolish rent entirely.
Which was absolutely categorically not Gandhi's agenda. He was fundamentally a conservative regarding property rights.
Very conservative.
He believed in a harmonious relationship between landlord and peasant. But the peasants didn't know that, or didn't care. They used his name as a magical invocation to legitimize their own class warfare.
And this unauthorized, rumor-driven energy propels the non-cooperation movement of 1920 to unprecedented heights.
To give you a sense of the scale, the Nagpur Congress session had 14,582 delegates. It was a true mass awakening. The British were paralyzed.
But then, right at the zenith of the movement's power, we hit the Chauri Chara incident in 1922.
Right. A violent clash in a small village where an angry mob chases police officers into a station and sets it on fire, killing them.
And in response to this single localized act of violence, Gandhi abruptly, unilaterally calls off the entire national movement. He throws the emergency brake on the whole revolution.
Now, traditional history accepts Gandhi's explanation at face value. He was so morally repulsed by the violence that he had to pause the movement to purify it.
But Sarkar, utilizing his history from below lens, digs much deeper.
It looks at the private letters, right?
He analyzes Gandhi's own private and public defenses of the withdrawal. And Gandhi essentially argued that if the masses won their freedom through this kind of violent, uncontrolled uprising, there would be no elite leadership left to control the unruly element once the British were gone.
Control the unruly element. That phrase is the smoking gun of Sarkar's entire thesis.
It's the quiet part out loud.
It reveals that Gandhi wasn't just morally afraid of violence. He was politically terrified of a true social revolution. He realized that the rumors had outgrown the reality.
If the peasants realized their own sheer power and successfully, violently overthrew the British state, they wouldn't stop there.
No. The next day, they would turn their pitchforks on the Indian landlords and the Indian capitalists.
Exactly. The elite leadership realized they were riding a tiger, and they chose to dismount rather than be eaten.
And this profound fear becomes the defining structural feature of the 1930s during the massive civil disobedience movement. Sarkar meticulously unpacks the Gandhi-Irwin Pact of 1931.
This is when Gandhi inexplicably compromises with the viceroy just when the civil disobedience movement is crippling the colonial state. Why does he surrender the leverage?
Sarkar follows the money. He shows that the compromise was largely driven by intense behind-the-scenes pressure from the Indian business class.
Ah, the capitalists again?
The boycotts and strikes had initially helped them, but now the prolonged instability was costing them massive amounts of money, and more importantly, the labor force was becoming dangerously radicalized. They begged Gandhi to restore order.
If the capitalists are pulling the strings, I have to imagine Gandhi's actions regarding the peasantry during this time were equally conservative. Did he intervene to stop agrarian rebellions?
He did, explicitly. Sarkar provides a devastating example from the United Provinces.
What happened?
The peasants, the Kisans, were mobilized and ready to launch a massive no-rent campaign against the oppressive landlords. It could have broken the back of feudalism there.
And what does Gandhi do?
He issues a public manifesto, explicitly ordering the Kisans to compromise. He tells them they must pay a minimum of 8 annas in the rupee, essentially 50% of their rent, to the landlords.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanics here. The leader of the national liberation movement actively stepped in to act as a debt collector for the feudal landlords, to protect their property rights from the very peasants who formed the base of his movement.
Yes, because in Gandhi's framework of class harmony, and in the elite's framework of preventing a socialist revolution, maintaining the social hierarchy was more important than weaponizing peasant anger to defeat the British.
This naturally leads to a massive question. Wasn't there a left-wing alternative? What about Jawaharlal Nehru?
Right.
We're taught that Nehru was the fiery, socialist, progressive face of the youth movement. Why didn't he split the party and lead the masses?
Sarkar acknowledges Nehru's immense intellect and his soaring, passionate socialist rhetoric. But he points out a tragic, repeating pattern in Nehru's career.
What pattern?
Whenever push came to shove, whenever a genuine rupture threatened the Congress Party, Nehru invariably capitulated to Gandhi and the conservative right wing. He provided the radical aesthetics, but surrendered the structural power.
Sarkar quotes the powerful industrialist G.D. Birla on this, and it is honestly humiliating for Nehru.
It's brutal.
Birla essentially tells his fellow capitalists not to worry about Nehru's socialist speeches. He privately notes that Nehru's radical words could be safely tossed in the wastepaper basket because the right wing knew, with absolute certainty, that Nehru would never actually act on them if it meant splitting from Gandhi.
The right wing brilliantly allowed Nehru to give the fiery speeches to keep the radical youth and the socialists energized and inside the Congress tent, knowing full well that they, the conservatives, held the actual steering wheel of the party machinery.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the endgame, chapters 7 and 8. The pattern is now set in concrete. Mass energy builds up from below. threatens to mutate into a genuine social revolution, and the elite leadership frantically steps in to cap it, control it, or compromise it away.
So what happens when this carefully managed pressure cooker is suddenly smashed open by the apocalyptic shock of World War II?
We actually get a preview of the elite's endgame behavior during a brief window from 1937 to 1939. Under a new constitutional arrangement, the Congress Party actually won elections and formed ministerial governments in several provinces. They finally had their hands on the levers of state power.
If the Indian capitalists and the conservative landlords are truly steering the ship, as Sarkar argues, I have to imagine the very first thing these new Congress ministries did was betray their radical base and crack down on labor.
That is exactly what they did. Once in power, these supposedly revolutionary ministries operated with deep structural conservatism. In Bombay, they passed the Bombay Trades Dispute Act, a piece of legislation explicitly designed to restrict the right to strike and protect capitalist factory owners from labor unrest.
And what about the peasants who voted for them, expecting land reform?
They were largely abandoned. The ministries failed to pass any meaningful structural agrarian reform that would threaten the zamindars. And perhaps most disastrously for the future of the subcontinent, the Congress leadership displayed incredible arrogance toward the Muslim League. In the United Provinces, they flat out refused to form a coalition government with the League after the elections.
That seems incredibly short-sighted.
Sarkar argues that this arrogant dismissal convinced many Muslims that a Congress-ruled India would mean permanent Hindu majoritarian dominance, which paved the way for Muhammad Ali Jinnah to rapidly and dangerously expand his mass base.
Then comes 1942. World War II is raging, the Japanese are at the gates of India, and the Congress launches the Quit India movement. Now, my understanding of Quit India was always a bit vague, just a general call for the British to leave. But Sarkar paints a picture of absolute, unvarnished chaos.
Sarkar describes Quit India as the most serious, massive, and violent rebellion the British faced since the Mutiny of 1857. And crucially, because the British immediately arrested the entire Congress leadership on day one, the movement was entirely leaderless. It was pure, uncoordinated, subaltern fury.
The scale of it is terrifying. The British arrested 91,836 people, and the repression they unleashed to maintain control was barbaric. Sarkar documents horrifying human details, like the 74 cases of rape by military forces in the Tamluk subdivision of Bengal alone.
Tamluk is a vital example because the peasants there didn't just protest, they actually overthrew the local government and established a Jatiya Sarkar, a parallel national government that ran the region for 2 years.
They ran it themselves.
Yes, the British utilized systematic state terror, including mass rape, burning villages, and indiscriminate aerial bombing specifically to break the agrarian solidarity that made these parallel governments possible.
The British managed to temporarily crush Quit India through sheer, overwhelming military brutality. But Sarkar argues that it fundamentally broke the illusion of empire. It proved definitively that the British could no longer rely on the passive consent of the governed. They could only rule through a massive, permanent, and economically unsustainable military occupation.
However, Sarkar makes a highly nuanced and crucial argument here about the actual timeline of independence. He insists that 1942 was not the final blow. The real tipping point, the moment British rule became mathematically impossible, occurred between 1945 and 1947.
This brings us right back to our opening hook, the post-war mutinies.
Yes. After the war, a new wave of subaltern movements erupted, and this time they infected the state apparatus itself. You had massive, violent protests demanding the release of the Indian National Army prisoners, soldiers who had fought alongside the Japanese against the British.
And the strikes.
You had a massive, crippling wave of post-war labor strikes paralyzing the railways and the postal service. And then the fatal blow, the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny of 1946.
The armed forces, the ultimate guarantor of colonial power, were no longer loyal. The sword of the empire had shattered in their hands.
British rule was now completely physically untenable. And this is where Sarkar's thesis finds its ultimate tragic vindication. How did the Indian elites, the Congress, and the Muslim League react to the Navy Mutiny?
As we mentioned at the start, they actively crushed it. They united with the British. Sardar Patel, the Iron Man of the Congress, aggressively commanded the sailors to surrender and told the public to go about their normal business.
Because they were staring at a unified, armed, anti-imperialist uprising that bridged Hindu and Muslim lines, and they were utterly terrified of it.
They were terrified because an armed, radicalized lower class could not be controlled by elite politicians in suits. The elites realized they needed the British to hand over the state apparatus, the army, the police, the bureaucracy completely intact, so that the new Indian ruling class could use that apparatus to maintain social order and crush any subsequent communist or peasant revolutions.
They didn't want a revolution that remade society. They simply wanted a peaceful transfer of upper management. They wanted the British to hand over the keys to the colonial machine, not smash the machine.
Exactly. And this sheer elite desperation for a quick, orderly transfer of power before the subalterns could organize further led directly and tragically to the nightmare of partition.
Sarkar argues that the famous Mountbatten Plan, the formula of freedom with partition, was not actually imposed by Lord Mountbatten. It was largely designed and pushed by VP Menon and Sardar Patel.
That completely flips the conventional narrative. Why would the Indian leaders willingly architect the vivisection of their own country?
Because they prioritized a strong, highly centralized state apparatus over a united but potentially decentralized or revolutionary India. They were willing to surgically sever the Muslim-majority provinces if it meant they could inherit a powerful central government in Delhi capable of crushing internal dissent.
And the human cost of that rushed elite compromise was apocalyptic. The borders were drawn in secret and announced at the last minute. The result was the greatest mass migration and slaughter in modern history.
Sarkar notes the Great Calcutta Killing, highlighting the suspicious, almost criminal passivity of the British military, who waited 24 hours to intervene while the city burned and thousands were slaughtered.
You have Nehru and the Congress completely abandoning their loyal Pashtun allies in the Northwest Frontier Province, throwing them to the wolves of the newly formed Pakistani state because it was politically expedient.
And amidst all this elite maneuvering and horrific communal carnage, you have the tragic, isolated figure of Gandhi. While the elites were popping champagne in Delhi, Gandhi refused to celebrate. He was wandering barefoot through the blood-soaked, riot-torn villages of Noakhali in East Bengal, trying to stop the violence single-handedly through sheer moral force.
Sarkar calls it Gandhi's finest hour. But the brutal irony is how utterly isolated he was from the very party machine he had built. He was a lonely prophet discarded by the elite politicians who had finally gotten their state. The elites got their mansions in Delhi, but the subaltern masses got the generational trauma of partition.
It is a devastating, brilliant synthesis of history. Sarkar constructs an incredibly complex, tragic narrative. But as we move into the final part of our deep dive, Part 7, we have to step back and play the role of the critic. We have to ask the hard historiographical question. Did Sumit Sarkar actually succeed in writing a true history from below?
To answer that, we have to bring in his harshest critics. And the most scathing critique in our material comes from a historian named Arvind N. Das. Das reviewed the book and essentially argued that Sarkar wrote a phenomenal, unmatched textbook, but that it entirely fails as a genuine history of the subalterns.
Das's argument is structural, and it is very difficult to refute. He points out a glaring mathematical reality of the book. If you actually sit down and count the pages, roughly 2/3 of the text is still obsessively focused on elite actions, viceregal maneuvers, Congress Party resolutions, and the ideologies of the intelligentsia.
So the camera might have been lowered to the street occasionally, but it always snapped back to the penthouse.
Exactly. Das argues that the subaltern masses are indeed brought into the narrative, but only ever as a counterpoint. They are used to explain why the elites reacted the way they did. The masses are reacting, protesting, dying, but they are rarely the prime movers of the narrative structure. Das delivers a brilliant, devastating summary of the book. He calls it History of the Below from Above.
Oof. History of the Below from Above. That is a laser-guided critique. It acknowledges the subject matter, but attacks the perspective.
Yeah.
And Das doesn't stop there. He also attacks the very foundation of the book, the timeline, the periodization debate.
Yes. Das argues that simply picking 1885 and 1947 as the bookends of your history proves you are still trapped in an elite mindset. Why? Because 1885 is the year a bunch of elite lawyers founded the Indian National Congress, and 1947 is the year elite politicians signed the papers for the transfer of power.
So it's an elite timeline.
Das argues that if you were writing a true subaltern history, you wouldn't care about the founding of a political party in Mumbai. You would bracket your timeline based on massive shifts in economic production or the dates of major continent-spanning peasant upsurges.
Okay, I have to vigorously push back on Das here, because frankly, that feels a bit pedantic, almost like an academic purity test. If you are setting out, as Sarkar explicitly did, to write a history of the Indian national movement, the mechanism that birthed the modern nation-state aren't 1885 and 1947, factually, objectively, the most necessary and logical bookends.
It's a fair point.
Can you even tell the story of a nation-state's birth without centering the political timeline that created the borders? It feels like Das is criticizing Sarkar for not writing an entirely different book about long-term agrarian economics.
That is a very fair defense of Sarkar, and it is the defense most historians mount. You cannot write a comprehensive history of an anti-imperial struggle without centering the empire itself and the specific political apparatus that negotiated its exit. The state is a reality you cannot ignore. This leads us to another critic, V.G. Kiernan, who offers a much more sympathetic yet profound perspective on the book's true value.
What is Kiernan's takeaway?
Kiernan argues that we shouldn't judge the book on whether it achieved a perfect, mathematically pure subaltern history. He says the book's true intellectual triumph is its realistic, clear-eyed, and often depressing appraisal of the limits of mass movements.
The limits, meaning it demonstrates what inevitably happens when raw, grassroots energy lacks a sophisticated structural organization to harness it.
Precisely. Sarkar shows beautifully and tragically how elemental, spontaneous mass outbursts, whether it's the Mopla peasants, the tribal Ugolins, or the leaderless crowds of Quit India, are incredibly powerful, but they are almost always eventually co-opted, channeled, or brutally crushed by organized elite structures. Uncoordinated anger cannot defeat a highly organized state.
Though to be fair to the critics, Kiernan and others do point out some significant missing pieces in Sarkar's analysis that date the book slightly. There's a glaring lack of gender analysis. The role of women in these movements is severely underdeveloped. The exploration of cultural history sometimes feels a bit thin compared to the heavy economic analysis, and the narrative does suffer from a teleological pull.
By teleological, we mean it sometimes feels like every event in the book is inevitably, uncontrollably rushing toward the tragic climax of 1947, which can blind the historian to other possibilities or alternative futures that existed in, say, 1920 or 1935.
But despite those flaws, despite the history from above critique, what is the lasting legacy of this massive undertaking?
Its legacy is absolutely monumental. Sumit Sarkar fundamentally changed the way a generation of historians looked at the archives. He proved that a deeply critical, unromanticized, structurally rigorous history of nationalism is possible. He managed to honor the incredible human hopes and the raw, staggering bravery of the masses, while simultaneously, almost clinically, exposing the structural constraints, the class terrors, and the elite compromises that ultimately betrayed those hopes. He forced everyone to look closely at the long shadows cast by the so-called great men of history.
So let's unpack what this all means as we wrap up this deep dive. If we zoom out, the core tension of Sumit Sarkar's Modern India is this constant, agonizing 60-year tug of war.
A tug of war.
On one side of the rope, you have the radical, explosive, deeply courageous, but highly uncoordinated energy of the subaltern masses. Desperate for freedom, not just from a British viceroy, but from daily hunger, from the landlord's whip, and from the moneylender's ledger.
And on the other side?
On the other side of the rope, pulling with all their might, you have the cautious, calculating, controlling grip of the elite leadership, terrified that the fires of liberty they are stoking might accidentally burn down their own mansions.
It is a dynamic that is absolutely not unique to India in 1947. It is the hidden engine of almost every major historical transition. And this is the critical lens I hope you, the listener, take away from this discussion. When you are reading a historical narrative, or even when you are watching a modern political movement unfold on the news today, I want you to ask yourself two questions.
Which are?
First, who is actually moving the pieces on the board? And second, and far more importantly, whose lived experience, whose daily reality is being left entirely out of the frame of the camera?
Which brings us right back to the penthouse window where we started. If history is usually presented as a pristine X-ray, showing clean binary breaks between empires and nations, Sarkar forces us to look at the murky, bruised tissue surrounding the bone. He drags us into the muddy waters where the actual lived experience of millions of people resides. Which leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling thought to mull over.
I'm ready.
If the true raw engine of historical change is the localized, messy, highly specific, and often uncoordinated suffering and resistance of ordinary people, is any cohesive, neat, easily digestible national history by definition just an elite fiction?